Hi, my name is Colleen Doherty, and I will be talking about the journey of the Pilgrims to their new settlement in America. The reasons the Pilgrims wanted to escape England was for many reasons. First, Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, and King James of Scotland took over for her. He was renamed King James I of England. He was a Protestant. There were two forms of church under the people. It was that of the Puritans, who wanted to stay with the Church of England, and the Separatists or Pilgrims, who believed that King James I would tolerate many different religious views. Soon after he became in power, they realized this was not the case, and he would not tolerate this. The Pilgrims made their first attempt to leave England to seek religious refuge in Holland in 1607. However, the English caught on to their plan, and they were arrested. In 1608, they made their second attempt to leave England for Holland, but only the men were able to board the ships and escape, while the women and children were arrested and taken into custody. Soon after this, however, the women and children met up with their fathers. There were many hardships faced in Holland during this time. The English, because they were new to the Dutch community, had low-paying jobs like clothing makers and other labor-intensive jobs. Their children were forced to work with them. The English were realizing that their identity was being lost in that of the Dutch identity. The reasons that they wanted to leave England in the first place was for religious freedoms, and they were realizing this was slowly not becoming the case in their newfound land. They then asked King James I from England for a charter from the London, Virginia Company to establish a new colony in the New World, which would be present-day America. The London, Virginia Company granted this. However, they told the Pilgrims that they would become indentured to them for a term of 7 years, meaning anything that they did work-wise, financially, they would have to give back to the London, Virginia Company, because the London, Virginia Company was basically wanting to get all financial assets that they could from anyone they could to grow their company. After the 7 years, though, the Pilgrims would then have their freedom. There were supposed to be two ships that set sail from England during this time, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Soon before their departure, the Speedwell was not able to make this trip through the Atlantic Ocean. The Mayflower was then the sole ship. It set sail from Plymouth, England in September 1620. They had 102 members on board. 41 of them were separatists, which were the Pilgrims, and the others were hired and paid servants from the London, Virginia Company to start a new life and gain money in the New World. The sleeping conditions were hard because this was a merchant boat, not a passenger boat. The ship had a carpenter on board, and the passengers had to pay him to build cabins or bunk beds for them to sleep on. Some just had hammocks because that is all they could afford. A family cabin was very, very small and simple, with just bunk beds laying across the floor, very small, because the carpenters, they couldn't afford the fees that the carpenters were charging. The food on board was basically salted meat, fish, beans, cheese, and beer. Not very nutritional. Here is a picture of the Mayflower sailing through the Atlantic Ocean in 1620. And another picture showing the rocky waters the ship endured throughout their journey. Basically, when the Atlantic Ocean was going very ferociously, people would be thrown into the walls on the decks, fall. There was a lot of injuries that occurred. An example of the daily activities aboard the Mayflower are they wake up, put away their bedding, do their prayers, eat breakfast. In good weather, they had activities such as reading, games, or exercise on the decks. Cooking by the women in good weather also was outside. Dinner was basically our lunch. Activities similar to the morning occurred after they ate. Then they would have supper, evening prayers, and fall asleep. After 2 months at sea, the Pilgrims arrived in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. While on board, they formed the Mayflower Compact, which was the first Constitution of Plymouth County signed on November 21st, 1620. The Mayflower Compact said that all indentured servants were promised to abide by the laws that were drawn up by the London, Virginia Company and the Church of England. Women were not allowed to participate in the governing processes, however. Once they docked, they decided to explore the land. And during the first couple of days, they had their first encounter on the beach with Indians. The Indians came out of the woods and started shooting them with arrows. Once the English started firing guns at them, the Indians left their arrows on the beach, and the new settlers decided to confiscate them. They decided to travel up and down the coast a little bit to see if they could find better land to make their first settlement, but finally decided to settle near Plymouth on 1621, on December 21st, 1620. Here is a picture of the Pilgrims arriving to their new country and exploring the land. During the winter, many people died from the Great Sickness. This was because of the cold weather and the lack of food. By January 1621, the first common house was built. In the spring 1621, many of the Pilgrims decided to plant the seeds that they brought with them from England. The colony now begins to take shape and look like a community. There was an Indian that came named Samoset. He was the first Indian to welcome the Pilgrims in March of 1621. The Pilgrims were very amazed by him that he was able to speak a little bit of English, and they were able to communicate back and forth. The Pilgrims received a lot of data about the Indians from Samoset. That is how they began their communications between the two groups. Squanto, who was another Indian, taught the Pilgrims how to fish for herring and to use this for the fertilizer for pumpkins, corn, and beans. Samoset and Squanto let the tribes know that the Pilgrims were friendly and to make peace with them, that they should not be afraid of them, and they should become friendly with them. On April 1st, 1621, there was a meeting between the leader of one of the big tribes, Massasoit, and the Plymouth governor, James Carver. During the next few months, the Indians and the Pilgrims worked together to grow crops and to build housing. The first Thanksgiving occurred in October 1621, where the Indians and the Pilgrims together shared food and played games. This was a very big celebration for the two groups because not only had they began to trust one another and work well with each other by growing crops, but now they were able to experience a feast and be one together. The food included venison, duck, turkey, corn, and pumpkin. Here's a picture showing the Pilgrims and the Indians together celebrating their first Thanksgiving and how joyous of an occasion it was. Another picture showing the actual feast between the Pilgrims and the Indians. And finally, the peace between the two. I found a few videos that I thought were very interesting. The first one is a video of the Mayflower from the History Channel. This basically shows a lot of the building of the Mayflower, the sailing of the Mayflower through the Atlantic Ocean, and finally the settling in Plymouth Colony. The second one's also from the History Channel, and it's basically just the history of Thanksgiving, showing how the two tribes, the Indians and the Pilgrims, came together and were able to enjoy such a wonderful feast. And then it goes into present-day Thanksgiving, which was established by our President Jefferson, which he made in November. versus their October when they celebrated it. That is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.